I think for any writer, I think it's important not to look at other writers. The reason I say that is because a lot of times people get discouraged by the rules or by other writers or by things like that because they're not matching what they see other people do. As long as you are writing, as long as you are sitting down and creating, you're doing the right thing. And especially with those first drafts, it doesn't matter. Just write.
Some experts chase attention, but the smart ones build authority. You're listening to the Authority on Demand podcast, where credibility becomes your competitive advantage. Every week, we're pulling back the curtain on how founders and leaders turn expertise into inbound demand through books that position, media that converse, and strategies that actually move the needle. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authority on Demand. Now, let's turn your authority into leverage. So there are writers who dance around the hard truths, who soften the edges of trauma, addiction, and loss. And then there's Juliet Rose. At 10 years old, she knew she'd be a writer. At 11, unfortunately, her mother passed away, and those dreams went silent for decades until life demanded she pick up the pen again. And the loss of her 4-year-old daughter to cancer, this experience most of us can't even fathom carrying. But these tragedies helped transform her into writing 14 books, 67 awards, stories that don't look away from the pain, but give voice to the voiceless, the broken, the ones society would rather pretend, don't exist, right? But these books help bring light to that and tell the truth no matter how it hurts. And I think we're going to learn a lot today about not only this concept, but what it's like to write about it too. So, Juliet, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast today. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much for having me on today.
Hey, real quick before we jump back in, if you're loving what we're doing here, hit that subscribe button and drop us a like. We're bringing you the best authors, the most real conversations, and all the writing wisdom that you didn't know you needed. So, stick around because it only gets better from here. All right, now let's get back to the conversation. What you have to talk about is powerful, and we have a ton to learn from it. But let's talk about you a little bit. I mean, it's the light side of things. You wanted to be a writer at age 10. What was it that captivated you about storytelling so young? And do you remember what those early stories were about?
Yeah, so I was a big reader, and that helps. I think when you're a reader at a very young age, you just are really like enamored with the idea of telling stories and what a story can bring to other people. And for me, it was no different. Like reading definitely made me feel like I could escape the world that I lived in and any of the traumas. And when I realized that people wrote books and I realized I could be a writer, that was pretty exciting for me. I'd always been kind of a storyteller, I'd tell crazy stories on the way home from the bus. And I can't really say what they're about because I was one of those people that would start with one idea and end up with 20 other ideas. But the kids would always ask me to like, oh, tell us a story. And we'd be walking home and I would just be making up a story. And then when I realized that that could be something you put on paper and into a book, I was really like, I knew then at 10 years old, I went to my mother, I'm like, I want to be a writer. I knew that. And it's always been a lifelong dream.
Right. Well, exactly. And I can kind of relate to that. I know when I was a kid too, I love to read, chapter books, that sort of thing. But I get what you mean. It definitely inspires a love for writing. They do go hand in hand. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of listeners today can relate to the experience of having that passion. And then as life goes on, well, it kind of drifts at sometimes. But life brought you back into it. And of course, for you in particular, it was due to some unfortunate tragedies, but it inspired your passion to get onto that computer and start typing. So talk to me a little bit about that, how these tragedies kind of shaped, reignited your passion for writing.
I think that for me, I went to school for journalism. So I started nonfiction. And so those tragedies originally were me kind of exposing, real life situations that people go through, not just myself, but other people as well. And then I did take a hiatus for a long time after my daughter died, simply because it was kind of hard to go back there, to go back to that nonfiction side of really just digging in was very painful. And when I did come back to writing, I came back to fiction. And what I realized with fiction is you can still bring in all those truths, but you can soften them, or you can change the outcome, or you can make it a little less painful. And for me, that was really the appeal of switching from nonfiction to fiction.
Right. Okay, of course. Yeah, so you did a little bit of both then, which is really cool, switching from nonfiction to fiction. Do you see like a huge difference in that? I always like to ask authors what they like. Is it hard transition from one to the other?
It is, and it is in the obvious ways. It can be a little freeing though. Like when you're doing nonfiction, you're really focusing on facts and research, and you want to make sure that you are really being authentic in what you're writing, because you don't want to add opinion and you don't want to add kind of flowery stuff or even just change the truth. So you tend to have to be very rigid about how you write nonfiction, where in fiction I can take some of those same facts, but I can change it and I can have a lot more fun with it. So I found fiction to be very freeing.
Right. Yeah, it is. I kind of have like a love-hate relationship with fiction. It's have the creativity, but then especially in the editing process as an editor myself, it tends to be more complicated because then you have to make whatever you're creative, right? But does that idea actually logically make sense? Does it?
Yes. Yeah. I am a research. I just go down the rabbit hole with research still for fiction, and that helps because I think I take a lot of elements of being a journalist, and I'm really factually putting those into fiction stories. That part is still really true. What I'm fictionalizing, obviously, is the characters or maybe the outcome of what happens or things like that, but the actual facts remain the same.
Right, of course. And yeah, that's what makes it easy. And challenging in a way to verify those facts, but there's really one right answer. So
Right.
it's the pros and cons of both. And yeah, you've definitely dabbled in just a ton of different genres and themes and topics. I was looking through your list here, and it's almost I can't even seem to pick one exact title to focus on. I mean, you have stories that go from dissociative disorders and ketamine abuse to suicide to LGBTQ. So it really just varies on all these topics. Is there a certain common thread that you think inspires you to write all these different types of books? What do you think? Does it just come to
Yeah.
you?
They come to me, but there is always that common thread of, and I call it social fiction. And I think that is the journalist side of me. There's always that kind of story that already exists in the world. And I'm really just taking that and then fictionalizing it. And a lot of it's my passion. Like I hear something that really matters to me, like it did when I wrote for journalism. I would find something I was passionate about and I would roll with it. And that's kind of what I'm still doing now, except now I get to have a little more leeway in what I'm writing down.
Mhm.
With nonfiction, obviously, there are nonfiction books and I read mostly nonfiction still. I do a lot of research with that. But with fiction, I feel like you really can just allow those ideas to just come through. You can change your mind. It's just a lot more flexible when you're writing fiction.
Right. Okay, exactly. And that kind of just relates back to what we were saying of the pros and cons of both types. So which was your most recent book then, the one that recently came out? Maybe we should focus on that one. Which one was it?
That was Soul Umbra.
So
And
Umbra.
that, yeah, and that one gets a lot into, it kind of dabbles on the line of, it's definitely like
It's like
thriller suspense.
horror, right? Like this
Right.
sounds
Yeah, I was going to say,
spooky.
because it dabbles on like kind of that thriller suspense, but it does get into horror as well. Because what I wanted to address when I did Soul Umbra was, we often look at mental illness from the outside looking at someone that has it. I wanted to really go through with somebody that had trauma and mental illness and how they see what's happening to them, but I wanted the reader to be in that same place. And that was a bit of a challenge because I was like, I don't want the reader to be like, oh, I see this happening to this person. I wanted the reader to think, okay, I'm kind of along for the ride. I don't know what's happening either. I don't know what's true or what isn't true.
Right. So what was your strategy for doing so? I mean, did you outline that and plot it out? Did it require a lot of revisions? I'm sure that wasn't an easy an easy task to achieve.
It was definitely a challenge, and I love to challenge myself because I feel like as a writer, if I'm constantly challenging myself, I'm also enjoying that process.
Mhm.
I'm not an outliner. I will say that. Like, it's just, if I try to outline it, it always changes. So then I'm kind of wasting my time. I knew what I wanted going into the story. The challenge was how to achieve it. Part of it was me having to also make myself not know what was true or wasn't true. So when I was writing it from this character's point of view, I wasn't committed yet to knowing whether or not what she was experiencing was happening or not, because I didn't want to know. I
Right.
wanted to be just as kind of along for the ride as the reader or the character.
Understood. And I like the concept of taking them along for the ride. You're not just speaking to them, you're kind of just bringing them on like a journey, which is really awesome. I like that phrasing you used. It's ultimately the underlining goal of as an author to take them along the ride.
Exactly.
Yeah. So kind of branching off of that, you dubbed it social fiction. I'm sure that it's challenging to write about such complicated topics, especially because some of them you've dealt with yourself before. So, what's it like to deal with such like vulnerable subjects and kind of translate that into the written word?
It is definitely a challenge. There are times that when I'm writing, I have to stop and step away. Emotionally,
Right.
I have to separate myself from what I'm writing. I want it to be authentic though, so I want to keep myself kind of in pain, if that makes sense. Like I want to make sure that I'm not stepping too far away where I'm then kind of, writing from the outsider's point of view. I'm still trying to write it as if I'm going through it. And it is a challenge. I mean, I've definitely had some struggles in my life that I have reflected in my stories. I have not until this point written about somebody losing a child, but one of my next books will get into that. And I always said I would never do that because I'm like, that's too close to home. But then one day I was in the shower and it kind of came to me that it was important in a way to kind of talk about that grief and what grief can do to our minds, in a fiction way, obviously, but, where it kind of makes us feel like maybe we are losing our minds a little bit.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of the balance that you discussed with your other book about and Soul Umbra trying to make it feel like you're in it and experiencing it at the same time. So in a way, it's a little bit self-sacrificing to go about writing in this way. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. It would be a lot easier to write stuff that was kind of just maybe fluffy or fun or whatever. But the other side of it is I feel like I have a calling to take not only my experiences, but other people's experiences and write them in a way that it opens the minds of people who haven't gone through that.
Right, exactly. Um, so for writers who are listening today who might be dabbling with certain similar topics that are challenging and vulnerable to write about, and they're dealing with that same kind of self-sacrifice, do you have a certain routine or method that you use to kind of bring yourself back to an even level after you step away from the computer, like a
Yeah.
recovery?
Yeah. So definitely. I do take walks and I hike, I roller skate. I do a lot of things that are kind of physically active because it distracts your brain. I also really love music. And so music for me can either put me into that place. So sometimes I'm trying to kind of tap into those experiences. I might pull music from that time and really listen to it and put myself back in a nostalgic way. On the flip side, when I'm done, I'll put on something usually completely unrelated, very upbeat, something that will just kind of get my brain out of that cycle.
Understood. Those are some really good tips, just changing the scenery, listening to some music, anything to just get yourself into a new headspace. So I love
Yeah.
that. It's important. But yeah, you did mention that you're working on another project. Let's speak of that a little bit. What's on the agenda? What's coming up next?
So I have two for this year that will be coming out. One is a follow-up to my book Through the Surface, which was my first horror book that I wrote. And that one kind of gets into suicide, it gets into family trauma, and it gets into demons, but you have to also kind of look at that side of like demons being reflective of our own internal demons. So like I tend to always have some side of it that's mental. So that one's a follow-up of that book. And I left that book hanging enough that I can leave that follow up. And that came out in, I want to say 2023, 2022, 2023. And I'm just now ready to kind of address that. And then the second one is the one I was speaking of earlier, which is it's going to get a lot into a father who has lost a child. And in the bargaining part of grief, which we all go through, you're willing to kind of do just about anything to see your child again. And so he opens a door that, yes, allows him to see his child again, but also allows a lot of really bad things to come through. And he has to figure out how to sacrifice again, to shut that door. So that'll be coming out later this year.
I love those concepts, and I can see how that plays directly into what we spoke of before about how it must be very challenging to write everything that you had the personal experience yourself. So right there as a prime example, I appreciate that you're dedicating yourself to that so the audience can not only learn from your experiences but grow with you by reading it. So that's a very profound mission that you have there. So yeah, I guess people can just stay up to date and be on the lookout for those releases.
Yeah, and I don't have titles yet, so I'll say that I'm like the person that comes up with the title once I've written the book. So right now I don't have titles, but they will have titles eventually. But the one will be coming out. The one that's the follow-up to the surface should be coming out around April or May, and the following one will come out in the fall.
Understood.
All right. Well, we'll again stay on the lookout. And where's the best place for people to check that out? We're still going to be chatting, but since we're on this topic, where should they head to?
AboveTheRainCollective.com. That is the publishing website. I have a page on there as well as some other authors. So yeah, definitely check that out. We try to keep that updated as soon as books are out to be available to buy, learn about, and then find links to.
Understood. Okay, well, we're going to put the links in the description box of this podcast today, everybody, so you can go ahead and check out Juliet's whole collection, really, in addition to the ones that are coming out soon. So yeah, get yourself reading the other 14 solo books and collaborative works that she has, and be on the lookout for the next ones. So let's chat a little bit more about the writing process. Our authors are always looking for more tips. We talked about vulnerability, but what about the revision stages? I'm sure there's a lot of that goes into it because you spoke about how you don't really outline. So what's that process look like? Do you have a team? Do you do it independently? Let us know a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. My writing process always starts long before I actually start to write. And I should say that first, because like there's so much that I scrap in my head or, like change before I ever sit down to really start that story. So while I don't outline, I usually have a really good concept when I finally sit down to start to write. But it changes. I mean, obviously the story is going to tell you where it's going to go sometimes, and that'll change what you do. So usually by the time I'm done with that first draft, there's not a whole lot of revision itself because it happens as I'm writing, like things will change. But editing, obviously, I'm an editor, a certified editor. I will do the first passes on my book, but then I always hand them off because no matter how good you are, you miss things. So yeah, I definitely hand it off. I have beta readers that I absolutely love too, that give me a lot of good feedback as readers. And if revisions happen, that's usually going to happen with them because they're going to say, oh, hey, I was confused by this, or I would have liked to have seen this. And if I get enough kind of the same feedback, I will go back and change the story maybe to suit that.
Understood. Okay, yeah. So beta readers are definitely a huge thing, and I do agree that a lot of us can edit independently. But yeah, it's not a solo endeavor, and it needs to be collaborative because when you get your mind too into your own manuscript, no matter how long you've been writing, there's always something that you might overlook. And yeah, it's important to see your reader's perspective. So I love that you gotta find the right beta readers. Based on that, have you ever had an experience with a bad beta reader? How can somebody filter between like a good one that you work with? It sounds like you have some consistent ones or like a inadequate experience.
I think if a beta reader doesn't know what the expectation is, you can end up with a bad beta reader. You have beta readers that come into it and they don't really understand what you're asking of them or what the expectation is, and maybe they delve in too deeply into little things. And so what you're really getting is somebody that's trying to be an editor. Or I think
because they feel like they have to say something.
Right. So I think setting really clear expectations with beta readers helps. I mean, I've definitely had beta readers that, maybe on the other side didn't really understand that they weren't just reading it and going, yeah, I liked it. Like they were to give feedback. So I think that's really just when you sit down, and I do now, of course, have like a group that I always go to, but like when I first started out, I didn't. And I definitely kind of learned trial by fire. Like I had people that I would have beta read, and like I said, they would take so long because they were going through each line, or they were just like, oh yeah, I loved it. And I'm like, that didn't really help. Let me refine it. So I think that when I realized, okay, they need to have guidelines for me of what to expect. And so when I send over the manuscript, I send over a sheet now that says, hey, this is what I'm looking for. That has really helped refine the beta reader process.
I love that tip. Yeah, guide the process. Tell them exactly what you want. It is a service after all. It's not just them, sitting back and, enjoying your book, which they can, but it's more so like to answer the questions and you have to direct them. Kind of like ordering a meal at a restaurant, maybe like, this is exactly what I want. Please give me that feedback. I see that.
Yeah, you can only complain so much if you haven't given them what they need to be successful.
Right. And I would say the same goes for editors as well, not just beta readers, right? You need to give them some guidance. I'm an editor myself, and I like to say I have a very good eye for what can improve a manuscript. And a lot of times people don't necessarily give me specific instructions, but I always ask that. I'm like, okay, like what are your concerns? Do you have anything, in particular that you need to address? So I like that. This is really good for people to hear.
Yeah, and as an editor, I do also, like, somebody comes to me and says, I'm looking for an editor and we've never worked together before. I do the same thing I do as an author, just on the flip side. I say, like that, what are you expecting? But also, this is my normal process. This is usually how I go about the editing process. Does that work for you? Because it's a good thing you don't want a bad match, because then someone assumes it's not good information. It might just not be how you're both working together. So it's really important, I think, in any relationship in writing, to really set out parameters before you ever do that.
Absolutely. And also just another question, kind of a little bit based off of this. You've written so many books at this point. I mean, I'm still trying to write my own. Well, first off, how do you find the time to do all of this? And does AI play any part in the process?
Okay, first of all, no AI at all. Yeah, no, I'm old school. This has to, in order for me to feel good about what I'm doing, everything has to come from me. Or if I'm using, say, even artists, it has to come from an actual artist that I've worked with. So as far as time goes, I do have a job as well. I'm a librarian, so it's not, I don't have kind of like the free flowing thing, which in a way can be actually good, because in my mind I know I have limited time, so I set it as a schedule. Well, today I'm going to get home and I'm going to write a chapter. And when I sit down, I usually have like a very specific guideline of what I'm going to write. So like, I know if I'm going to sit down to write, I have to complete one chapter. I
Right.
don't stop midway. I don't write 500 words. For me, that's what works. I have to complete something, because I don't know when I'm going to be able to come back to it because of life and jobs and kids and dogs and all kinds of fun stuff. Like, I just don't know. So I want to make sure whatever I've done, I've completed that cycle that time. And then I can come back, kind of scan it, and then do the next chapter the next time. But it doesn't leave me kind of hanging. It is a challenge, though. At one point, I worked from home for a company, and that was a little bit easier because I could kind of get up, sit down, do an hour with writing, and then get into work. Now I leave, so like, it depends on a lot of factors. There are, weeks that go by that I don't write, and sometimes I write every day, but it's not as consistent as I'd like it to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it sounds like you have to set yourself a goal. You don't just sit down and willy-nilly it, and you have to
Yeah,
actually
no.
put it into your schedule. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's just all really important tips. I think, there's a lot to be learned there. So I guess I'm curious, as we begin to, reach the end of our conversation here. Do you have a favorite out of all of your books? I mean, there's so many of them. We spoke a little bit about one, about Soul Umbra, but what stands out most in your mind, would you say, out of all of them?
Well, Soul Umbra is definitely one of them, because when I wrote it, I really challenged myself outside of my comfort zone, and it paid off. So that was good. But like, honestly, there's three of my books are actually interlinked, which are Done, which came out this year, Do Over, and We Don't Matter. They actually can be read as standalones, but they actually have interlinking characters, and it all deals with addiction. So it starts with addiction. I actually wrote them out of sequence. So out of sequence, I wrote them Do Over, We Don't Matter, and then Done. In sequences, Done, Do Over, and We Don't Matter. So starting with Done, it gets into one particular boy's addiction. And
Mm.
then the series goes into like kind of the fallout and how it affects other people up from the outside. So the second book actually takes somebody that's a stranger to the town and comes in and shows kind of her perspective of watching, the fallout of addiction in this small town and in the youth. And then the last book gets into the main character in the first book's little brother and how it affected him as he grew up and dealing with mental illness because of his brother's addiction. So I have a real passion for that, because I have a real passion for that. Like, addiction is something I do speak about a lot. Addiction is something that I have personally experienced, within family members, within myself. So it's something that I do kind of come back and circle around quite a bit. So that series, and specifically that book Done, that came out this year, are a real passion project for me.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. And that's what I love to hear. It's a passion project. And even though you have to find the time in your schedule, as you talked about, it's something you love doing and you can be excited to do because it's meaningful. So thanks for sharing that. If anyone kind of wants to learn more, you can find it on Amazon, I'm sure, and also on your website. So perfect. So yeah, any other last bits of writing advice that you just want to offer the audience today? What can we end off on that gives them hope for their next writing session?
I think for any writer, I think it's important not to look at other writers. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times people get discouraged by the rules or by other writers or by things like that, because they're not matching what they see other people do. As long as you are writing, as long as you are sitting down and creating, you're doing the right thing. And especially with those first drafts, it doesn't matter. Just write, just write, just write. Enjoy it, feel it. Don't compare yourself to other people or think that you're failing. those second drafts, your editors, your beta readers, they'll be the ones that come in and kind of help you shore that up. But initially, you got to just write and not talk yourself out of it.
Of course. Yeah, don't talk yourself out of it too. Don't say like, oh, like I'm too tired after my
Yes.
day, or oh, I should really just do the dishes or something like
Yeah.
that.
And we've all done that. So yeah.
Yeah, like productive procrastination is what
Yes.
but it's definitely important to do that. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that's a perfect note to end on. If you have a dream, if you have a vision, a message that needs to be heard, don't let anything get in your way. I mean, some of us have huge obstacles, like maybe a opposition to your topic or something like that. But if it's just a matter of scheduling, just fit it in there, right? No excuses.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, thank you so much for coming. You definitely have an important message here, everyone. Juliet writes about characters who've been pushed to their limits, characters who lost everything, hit rock bottom, faced demons, literal and metaphorical. But that's the lesson for us all. Just keep pushing through, no matter what you have going on in your lives, both in your personal lives, your work life, and your writing life too. So I love that. Thanks so much for coming on, Julie. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you. This was a great conversation.
For sure. And yeah, everybody, if you're inspired today, all the links for Juliet Rose's work are in the description box of this podcast. Click on over, get connected, be on the lookout for their upcoming books. And the next time, keep writing, keep leading, and keep inspiring. We'll see you next time on the Authors on Mission podcast.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Authority on Demand podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with a founder or a leader who's ready to stop being the best kept secret in their industry. If you want to turn your expertise into inbound demand, head to authorityondemand.com to see how we help clients go from unknown to in demand. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, and I'll catch you on the next one. Now, go build some authority.